Okay, so hi everyone and welcome to this event hosted by Doctors in Distress called Reflective Spaces, Nurses Care, We Need Care Too. It's great to have so many of you here and to introduce myself, my name is Susanna and I am Head of Programmes for Doctors in Distress. So as you all know, this is an event for any nurse, HCA, midwife, OT, physio or health visitor in the UK that has been shielding or has long COVID. And I actually think we have someone from each profession on this call, which is brilliant. So we have a big variety in people who are here. So before I hand over to our chair, Claire, I just wanted to explain a little bit about how the programs work so you know the practicalities before we get to hear from our wonderful facilitators and speakers. So today is our opening webinar. We've had a few questions about whether you'll be able to see people. You'll just see us today, but when it comes to the groups, you will be able to see everyone else. So after today, from the 1st of September, from every Wednesday, from 11 to 12:15, you will be in a facilitated group. So there will be no more than 12 people in your group and you will be there with the same people for the entirety of the 8 weeks. So this is a space for you to speak about your experience of shielding, long COVID, to share any anxieties or concerns that you may have, but it is a safe, confidential space for you to just come and chat with other people. So we have two fantastic speakers joining us today. We have Amy Overend, who's going to speak to us about her experience of shielding, having previously specialised in both adult and neonatal critical care nursing. And then we're also going to hear from Emma Dillon, who has just completed our first Nurses with Long COVID programme. So just to say, I'll put my email in the chat box so you have it if you have any questions. We're also taking any questions which we will answer through the webinar, so please do feel free to ask any questions. And now I will pass over to our chair, Claire Gerarda, who's going to say a little bit about why the charity was set up, and then we'll speak with our facilitators, Gavin, Geraldine, Viv and Steve. So over to you, Claire.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Susanna, for all your hard work. So despite its title, Doctors in Distress, the charity is actually for all healthcare professionals, and it was set up, and I know Amandip's on this call, following the death through suicide of a cardiologist who was Amandip's brother. And what we found is that it's not just doctors, but all healthcare professionals have a natural disinclination for seeking help. And if we're going to reduce the risk or the rate of suicide amongst all health professionals, we need to be able to provide spaces where you can come together, talk about your work, talk about the emotional impact of your job, talk about the impact that, for example, COVID has had on you. And in the talking, and really, truly, a problem shared really is a problem halved. We can help make people feel that they're not isolated and not alone. So that's the charity's aim. It really is to reduce suicide through creating safe spaces for people to come together. We're so grateful to you all to come. I think in particular nurses have done an amazing job. It's you who really have kept the NHS moving, have kept our patients safe, and have really done vast amount of the heavy lifting on behalf of our population. So I'd like to thank you, but also the other healthcare professionals on this call who are really sometimes the unsung heroes of the NHS. Now, we've done these before, and we're going to find out in a little bit from the facilitators what it's about. Clearly, because of COVID, we can do these remotely. Hopefully, when the real world starts, we'll start putting on some face-to-face ones, but it'll be a lot harder for people to attend. They are confidential spaces. We try and keep the groups small enough that you can feel what's called contained and listened to, but large enough that you don't feel pressurized to talk if you don't want to. And everybody that's facilitating these groups are skilled in what they do, and they've done it before. So if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat box. But otherwise, what I'm going to do now is just basically talk to the facilitators who will be running your groups, and just so they can explain what will go on and what you might expect before then listening to people who have actually had a lived experience of long COVID and of actually being isolating. So can I start then just by introducing the four facilitators? Vivian, do you want to say just a very brief word about yourself, and then I'll go round in the order that I can see you on the screen. You're muted.
Hello, I'm Viv Hart. Yes, good to see you all, although I can't see you. I'm an individual psychotherapist and group analyst. I've worked in the NHS doing that psychotherapy work for 26 years, both individual and group work. And I've done a number of groups with doctors in distress now, particularly long COVID and other members of staff on the front line.
Fabulous. And can I hand you over to Geraldine? Geraldine, you're on mute. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Geraldine. I'm a qualified social worker, so that's my kind of main job. And I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist, so I do that kind of part-time. And I've done an ITU group with Dr. yourselves, and I also do volunteer work with therapists, Frontline 19, Therapist 19, Frontline.
Fabulous, Geraldine. And I have a conflict of interest then, because my son is also a social worker, and my God, you have worked hard during COVID. Absolutely worked hard. Steve.
Yes, hello.
Just say who you are. You've gone.
Sorry, yeah, my connection is still pretty poor. My streams at the moment because I'm only getting fragments. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Great.
Who are you? Just introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name's Steve, psychotherapist since the 1990s, work primarily in employee support in government organisations.
Thank you. And
then moved to the fire service to special, worked closely with the Royal Marines on that project. And the last piece of work I did was in support of
Steve, you're very
fire service in the aftermath of the Grenfell disaster.
Lovely. You might want to put your camera off, Steve, because you're very intermittent. I know you're there, so I'll bring you in. Gavin, last but not least.
Hello. Yes, my name's Gavin.
I'll try.
Oh, Steve's still coming in a bit. Yeah, I work as a integrative CBT therapist, and I also do training work. And yeah, currently I volunteer with Frontline 19, like Geraldine. And yeah, really excited to bring that into a group format. So yeah, lovely to be here.
Thank you. Now we've got a slight disadvantage because unfortunately the Gavin and Steve have got poor reception, so you may feel slightly out of this, and it may be Geraldine and Viv. But let me just start it off then. Vivian, and you're a group therapist. You're probably the one that's if you like, a specialist group therapist. Just briefly, what is the benefit of a group? Why should people who maybe prefer to have individual therapy? What's the point of going into a group?
I think the main point of being in the group is the peer support and the connections that people might get with other people about the similar difficulties they may be experiencing. And so they might not feel quite as isolated as they had previously when they think they may be the only person that's struggling or the only person that's not able to work, when actually there's quite a lot of us that are going through the same struggles. And it's nice to, it's actually really helpful to be able to hear how other people are managing. And I suppose it's also very good to get support. People can offer practical advice. It's not necessarily the group's purpose to offer practical advice, because that can be got from elsewhere, but at least people know that there are things that can be offered to them from other members who've gone through similar experiences.
Thank you. And Geraldine, picking up on that then a little bit, I mean, we know that groups, we can gain support from each other through groups, but I imagine there's more than just support. I imagine groups help mirror our behaviour. We can see in others what we might be experiencing ourselves. I mean, picking up on Vivian, are there any other positive factors on groups?
I think I would echo just what Vivian had said about the right now I'm struggling to think of anything else for the in terms of positives, because I think Viv's covered them all. It is just about that kind of shared commonality. I know the one I done before, it's very much, I felt it's very much people don't talk about their feelings in the NHS, and I think for a lot of them it was quite reassuring to know they were all experiencing the same sort of feelings, and that there was other people going through the same thing, and they weren't actually going through it alone. So that was a major thing for the group, just having that, they being able to talk about how they were feeling and how it was impacting them, and also how it was impacting with them being unwell, how it was impacting on their families as well.
Because particular mental illness, it's such a stigmatizing process to be in, that to actually even admit that I mean, we'll hear from Amy and Emma later on, but to actually say that you're struggling, to be able to share that in a group without sanction is pretty positive. But can I bring you in, Gavin? What about confidentiality, though? A lot of people concerned that in a group people will tittle-tattle about them or take outside what's said in the group and say, oh, you never heard what I heard in my group today. Does that happen, or is it a safe space that we talk about?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think the ground rules for the groups will, you know, it's important that any information connected to any individual stays within that space. And certainly that would be my approach as the facilitator. That we would all agree to respect the confidentiality of each member of the group, whilst also at the same time, obviously, what we learn from each other in the groups, that learning needs to come out of the group and into our lives. But anything that is, you know, connected to any individual needs to stay in the group. That would be my approach to confidentiality.
Yeah, I mean, and though we can't mandate it, on the whole, I mean, I know, Vivian, I'll bring you in a little bit after Steve, but on the whole, people do respect that. It is very impressive how people do respect. I mean, we're not in, I mean, maybe I'll bring Steve in now. We're not expecting people, these aren't therapy groups, and I think we have to absolutely be clear. Whilst they're being run by therapists, they're not therapy groups. Whilst people may want to bring what's happening into their personal lives into the group, it's more around a space to share the impact of isolating, the impact of COVID with each other, and clearly how our own lives are going on will impact on that. But it's not about that. But Steve, do you want to say something about the confidentiality and also whether you think everybody has to speak in a group? I mean, there is I mentioned it right at the start, the fear that you have to talk, but actually you don't have to talk, do you?
No, sorry, I've just got myself sorted out, I hope. No, certainly not. There should be no pressure for people to talk, because that could be very off-putting for some people. And obviously confidentiality is one of the main boundaries of any group, a supportive group like this. So I think it needs making overt at the start. I think it needs reminding probably at every session.
Yes, but it's, have I gone?
No, you're there.
Sorry, suddenly you all disappeared. Yes, I think it is, but I think the point of it is that some people will want to talk a lot, some won't want to talk at all, but the facilitator's skill is to bring everybody in who wants to speak. And I know Vivian may say this, sometimes people in a group take on different roles. So while somebody might be silent, they're not silent and disengaged, they're actually silent and engaged and listening. Isn't that right, Vivian, in the groups that you've been running on long COVID? Do you want to explain a little bit how they've been gone and what you've experienced?
Well, I think in the two long COVID groups I ran, facilitated, there were about 12 people in each group, and some, yes, did speak more than others. And part of my responsibility as a facilitator is to help people come in if they want to. And it may be to actually listen to what somebody might be saying and see if anyone connects, help connect across members in the group and say, do you see that? And I suppose the wonderful thing about Zoom is I can see everybody's responses on one screen, whereas if you're sitting in a circle face to face, actually you're not always face to face. So I'm constantly sort of, you know, observing what's happening with you all from your facial and body expressions, and you can see if somebody is feeling uncomfortable. And I might not say to that person, you look uncomfortable. I might say, I wonder if there is a lot of discomfort at the moment about what's being spoken about, and does anybody want to reflect on that in the group to everyone?
And I imagine that Zoom has been a godsend for many people on this call, because if you're shielding, clearly you can't go out, and we'll find a little bit about that with Amy later on. But Geraldine, your experience of running groups, how do you get over the fact that some people are a little bit anxious about speaking and might need some help? What do you do to try and help?
I think it's just about using kind of gentle encouragers. Sometimes, you know, somebody's going to they want to speak, but they haven't got that opportunity. So when the person that has speaking kind of stops, you know, I always say, you know, well, Gavin, you looked as though you were going to say something. Do you want to come in? And then that then gives them the option about whether they want to come in or not.
And that's a very good technique. Gavin, is there anything you want to say?
There is actually, yeah. Just when you were earlier asking about the power of working in groups, and something else I think is really important is, especially for people who are working in the helping profession, and that you're perhaps not at work right now, it's a great opportunity to help others, and that's part of, you know, the process is seeing yourself being able to have an impact helpfully on other people. I think that's an important ingredient of group work as well.
And I think that is such an important issue, not just for what you said, but also all of you on this call are in the helping professions. And there's one thing that I've learned over 15 years looking after people that help others is how little time we take to help ourselves. And you will all have made amazing sacrifices, not least having to shield and be urging yourself to want to do the job that you were trained to do. Sorry, that seems to talk amongst yourselves, my other phone, but also how difficult it is for health professionals to move from patient to professional. Really difficult. Steve, is that in your experience? Have you helped health professionals to take on the patient role?
No, my work has been mostly with emergency workers, but they find it similarly difficult to be a recipient of assistance because their raison d'etre is to help others, whether they're, you know, firefighters, ambulance, or police. So they do find it difficult, particularly in the more pseudo-military the organisation is, or like the fire service. They find it extremely difficult to ask for help. They're not supposed to. It's not, you know, kind of in their fibre to do that. But the help they really, really do need, but it's all hidden. And instead of asking for help, they'll make macabre jokes about things they've seen. And that camaraderie is very, very useful, but there's times when that's not enough.
Absolutely. So somebody's put a question about maybe being in the wrong group. Well, I hope you're not. This is the group for healthcare professionals who have been shielding. And we're just finding out a little bit from your facilitators. You can get a sense of who they are, what they do, and what you can expect in the group. And then somebody else has asked about advice about returning to work. Well, that may come up in Amy's talk and Emma's talk. As I said at the start, or at least Susanna said, this isn't really a practical how to attend your HR appointment and what to say. This is more about learning from peers who are in the same position. And whilst some of these practical issues might come up, it may actually reflect how frightened you might feel about going back to work, how frightened you might feel about approaching HR to tackle this, how frightened you might feel about not being able to say, I don't feel up to it, or I'm scared about going. I've been shielding for 18 months and hey ho, you're expecting me now to put myself right into the firing line. So I think those sort of questions are very pertinent questions, and I think they will come up. So without further ado, I'm going to now speak to Emma. Emma, about your experiences with long COVID, and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Emma Dillon. I'm a nurse by trade, a mental health nurse, but my role is working in nurse education. So I'm the professional lead for mental health nursing at Northampton University. So I was a little bit anxious about joining the long COVID course because I wasn't your traditional nurse working in the front line. However, we had been working face to face, educating our nurses. I developed COVID in October 2020. Felt very guilty because I gave it to all of my family, including 4 elderly parents and in-laws. So, you know, you talk about the emotions that come from this. There was a lot of guilt around that. They were very poorly. And I really struggled as a mental health professional in particular, who teaches daily on looking after yourself and seeking intervention. And I felt really vulnerable when I was the patient. I ended up being quite poorly, lots of trips to hospital and under a range of specialities, and then obviously was diagnosed with long COVID after the 12 weeks, and was really completely sort of incapacitated with the illness on every level. I'd gone from a high functioning professional, a PhD student, mother, wife, daughter, etc., to suddenly, you know, just unable to even get up the stairs. So it was a massive physical and emotional challenge, and I found it very difficult to verbalise that. So I was off work for 7 months, and have gone back on a phased return, which has been really tough because I'm a very different person. The whole experience has, in lots of ways, positively made me reflect on life, my professional outlook. I was very driven, and I've just kind of taken a back seat. It's not easy, but I think regarding the long COVID group that I joined, at first I was a bit apprehensive, didn't really know what it was going to be like. Again, felt vulnerable. I was this person who teaches other people how to look after themselves, and here I was not really knowing how to navigate help. But the group was fantastic. Fiona was my facilitator. She was so gentle, and like the guys have just been saying, she somehow very subtly allowed us all to ventilate as much or as little as we wanted. There was no pressure at all. We were all very different in our group. We were all nurses, but we were all in completely different roles, different ages, different nursing professions. But I found it such a safe space. And I think for me, I had attended a local long clinic support group on a webinar, which was great. But as you've said, Claire, I think health professionals have this certain, I don't know, maybe it's our values or whatever, but we're very harsh on ourselves, and our standards are like, they're not normal standards on your recovery or anything. And so it was just lovely being with people who actually felt very similar. And sometimes you felt a bit angry that maybe you'd pick this up in your work. You can't really prove that, but possibly. And you know, I've been lucky to have great experience with my healthcare team, but others haven't. And you know, some people felt really let down. They'd given their time, and now when they needed it, it was difficult. So
what did you find, Emma? How was I mean, you talked about being amongst equals, i.e. amongst your peers. And some people might be a bit scared of opening up amongst fellow professionals because you might know them or they might know you. But actually what you're actually saying, it felt better because they automatically understood the guilt, the identity you have, the fact you said you've gone from being this really super teacher trainer to someone who I imagine barely was able to get out of bed. I mean, is that it? The pros of meeting peers was far outweighed the negativities?
I think it was, absolutely, because, you know, you do go in apprehensive and you think, oh, you know, what it's going to be, and are they going to be coping better than me, or, you know, and all of those things.
Competition.
Yeah, we are peers, but I think, you know, we all had a lot of guilt about letting our colleagues down who were still out there in the thick of it in a, you know, variety of ways. So you have that. You somehow feel you've let yourself down. You know, how did I let myself get so poorly? Which obviously
you blamed yourself for becoming ill.
Yeah.
There's somebody that's posted something on the chat who's been unwell for 17 months and feels isolated with long COVID. I mean, though this is a group for those who are shielding, but there's a lot of similarities about isolation, guilt, fear.
Yeah.
What advice would you give? And as I said, it's not practical advice. We're not saying about going to HR, but
yeah,
I mean, you were isolated, weren't you, Emma?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd shielded for the period before with my son because he's got a chronic health condition, and just I was working at home at that point until I went back to uni. So I just took a sort of moral decision to support him, really, and I could. But the long COVID was very isolating. You know, as the rest of my family healed and went back to work and functioning, even my 90-year-old father-in-law, you know, was somehow getting on and I wasn't. So I was isolated. I didn't know anybody who really had experienced anything like this. No friends, family or colleagues. I was the only one. So regarding the isolation, I think it's just, for me, I had no energy. I spent, weeks in bed, but I would somehow just sort of scroll through some social media. I wasn't really taking it in at all, but I felt a connection. And I was honest, I did a blog because I didn't know how to ventilate to people, and I hadn't got the energy to text back. I couldn't talk for a couple of months. I had a lot of vocal cord damage, and so I just started blogging. It was hard because I didn't have the energy or the mental capacity really to do it, but it was a way of kind of telling people I'm not trying to push you away or isolate myself even more, but I just can't engage. I can't engage, and I want to. So I think, and I was really honest, which was hard.
Yeah, and apologies, by the way, this group is for those who with long COVID as well as shielding. I'm clearly in my own long COVID fogging state. So it is this isolation. I mean, I find this with all healthcare professionals. They somehow believe that they wear magic white coats, that by having an RCN or an RMN in front of you, or a midwife or a healthcare assistant, somehow by having a training, you're suddenly immune to illness. And not only are you immune to illness, but that even if you become unwell, you should know what to do. And even if you know what to do, others are telling you should sort yourself out, which is what I think you're describing. And you've now come out the other, or more or less out the other end, Emma. You're improving, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so much better than I was, so much better, and I'm back to 4 days working. I'm very lucky. My university have been fantastic, and because I've just been really honest, I've gone back as a much quieter, still very passionate about what I do, but I'm quieter and behind the scenes. I haven't got that voice like I used to have, but I found different ways, and I honestly think, and it took so much for me to be really honest and just tell people when I'm struggling, because I still have days when I can't, and just be honest and reach out. But we're still in touch with the ladies in my group. We happen to just be all ladies, and that's been great, because we're all at different stages. Some have been back to work and it's not gone so well, others are doing okay. And I just, if you're a bit unsure, just take a leap of faith, I think, because nothing bad's going to happen. The worst is you'll think it's not for me, but actually it really helped me.
And Emma, I'd like to thank you as well, because we met just before this webinar started, and you said you joined the long COVID group we had before, and you want to now give something back, hence the fact that you're here. And again, that act of altruism is something that many healthcare professionals have, and I think you epitomise it. And I'd just like to thank you so much. And
no, thank you. And Fiona's not here today, but thank Fiona as well, and everybody. Really great. And my advice would be just give it a try. You've got nothing to lose.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sana, over to you.
Yeah, so thank you, Emma, again from me. It's been great to hear from you. We are now going to hand over to Amy, who was shielding during the pandemic. Amy also had a little boy during the pandemic, which I'm sure she'll talk to us about. But Amy, over to you.
I'd just like to say that before you start, Amy is a wonderful human being who is part of something which I chair called I was going to call it the long COVID group, Amy, called the NHS Assembly, which is a group of people coming from health and social care, lay people, whatever, coming together to basically help keep the NHS plan on track. And Amy had our first NHS Assembly baby in the middle of COVID. So we feel absolutely honoured that you were first of all on the group, on the NHS Assembly, but also you gave us such joy in the time when there was joy less, if we cast our minds back to last year and the beginning of this year. So Amy, you've told us a little bit about yourself, haven't you, about the fact that you are a nurse and you're a very senior nurse, but tell us a little bit about your shielding experience, what it's been like for you.
Yeah, so to kind of give a bit of context, 3-4 years ago, I all of a sudden became really unwell out of the blue, having always been generally okay. I ended up in intensive care, multiple trips to resus for no kind of apparent reason, I just kept going into anaphylaxis. And if anyone knows that, I'm sure all of you do, it's very close to stopping breathing and needing lots of adrenaline. And it started with a cold. And what happened was the cold triggered something in my immune system to produce mast cell activation syndrome. So I overreact to, in a very dramatic way, not much like me personally as well, but overreact to the smallest things. So if I get a cough or a cold, it will floor me. I can potentially need intensive care just for that on a daily basis. So I have to be very careful. So to kind of give you a bit of context, the last time I went into anaphylaxis was because my bath was too hot. So the hot water on my skin caused me to have a reaction, and I ended up in hospital for 2 weeks with that. So it's a challenging condition to kind of live with. So Claire and I heard about COVID quite early on from the NHS Assembly, and we kind of knew it was coming, but I don't think any of us knew the extent of what it was going to be. I think we thought it was a virus that was going to come over, but it was, it was going to be okay. We've got the people coming back from Wuhan, they were going to be isolated and it was going to be fine. And then about 2 months later, my GP called me and said, whatever you do not go into work. I know you're a frontline nurse, do not go into work. This will kill you. Which for a phone call from a GP is slightly terrifying. And just before COVID kind of became a thing, I found out I was pregnant with my first baby as well. So not only did I have a crazy condition that was difficult with pregnancy anyway, but throw in a worldwide pandemic, and it was somewhat of a challenging time to say the least. So it was very scary when it all started, and I spoke to my boss, and I remember sitting in my boss's office in tears going, I wish I wasn't pregnant right now. Not because I didn't love my son or anything like that, but for me, that was causing me more concern. I was happy to go to work with my condition and not shield and just, grind in like everyone else did, and I would deal with myself later. But this time it wasn't just about me, and it was about my child, and I was having to protect them as well. So I was one of the very first people to shield. I got the letter very early on, so it was early March 2020. And I have shielded for 15 months since. So even post having my little boy, we carried on shielding. Again, because the condition that I have, having a vaccine was not possible initially. I ended up having to go on a very long 6 months worth of drugs to control my immune system enough so that when I had the vaccine, I wouldn't go into anaphylaxis. So it was 18 months of being completely isolated from all my normal support work, isolated from my family, and not just my kind of day-to-day, I love being a nurse. I think anyone who goes into medicine loves doing what they do. And that was ripped away from me overnight. And my group of friends were ripped away from me overnight, because you would see them every day at work, but I couldn't see them. It was difficult to chat with them because they were just exhausted and they had bigger priorities. I really had, the only way I can describe it is survivor's guilt. I didn't have to survive a pandemic. I was safe at home in my bubble with my baby and my fiance, and I was, relatively safe. Yes, I was kind of protecting myself from the world, but, I'm an intensive care nurse. I should have been in the depths of it with everyone. I should be feeling what they were feeling. And, as a nurse, everyone was being banded with the superhero, you're a hero, oh, you work for the NHS, you're amazing. And for me, that was really hard because I didn't feel like I was doing enough. I didn't feel like I was worth that title of a key worker, because what had I done apart from sit at home and not do much apart from some meetings and writing some policies? I didn't feel it was what I should be doing. So it was really difficult. And I think having had both my vaccines, I ended up kind of taking stock of life a bit like Emma. And I never thought I would step away from clinical working ever. But actually now I don't work on the front line because I don't feel safe. I moved into transformation nursing, so I work remotely from home the majority of the time. And I'm really lucky that I'm still part of the NHS. I'm still a nurse, but I just work in a non-clinical capacity now. which was really difficult because, again, it feels like a part of me has just been lost because of this virus. If this virus hadn't happened, I would still be on the front line working. I'm really lucky.
I mean, what a story. I mean, there you go from being an unbelievably active intensive care. You were in neonatal intensive care, weren't you?
Yeah, so did both adult and neonatal.
And suddenly along comes a pandemic. But in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of that sorrow of you having to isolate and be around, you fall pregnant and you have a life. You have a new life. So your story is an extraordinary story, but presumably the isolation, despite the fact you've got this new life, so you couldn't be isolated from your baby. How did you deal with the isolation? Was it just endless Zooms, endless Skype calls, endless WhatsApp?
I found it really hard, especially after having Rupert, who's my little boy. He definitely helped, but he also definitely hindered, because you don't have time with a newborn to be chatting with people and Zooming and WhatsApping. So that isolation actually, I think for me, grew exponentially having a baby. So it was lovely because I had someone at home with me, but at the same time, it was never ending. It was constant. I didn't, as much as you can try and WhatsApp and call and do Zooms, I just didn't have the mental capacity to sit and be happy on the end of a phone when I know I should be, because I've had a baby and it should be lovely and I should be sharing him with everyone. But I was also really angry that I couldn't share him with anyone, and that it compounded and escalated. I was really lucky that my partner was allowed to work from home, so I had him for the majority of the time. But when lockdowns kind of ended, his employer was like, well, no, we need you to come back in. So again, that support network was taken away, and again it was really isolating. And I think it took me a good 6 months to really start to feel like I could start contacting people again and being kind of open to just speaking to them about things.
And others here will also have had life events like this. I mean, they may not have had babies, but they might have had deaths, they might have had losses, all of which require the human touch. I mean, literally the human touch. Touch is the first sense that any of us use, way before we can understand, way before we hear. Your baby will have touched you. And the group, if you like, not to over-egg it, of course, allows us not to physically touch, but allows us to touch each other emotionally, and allows us to psychologically touch each other so that we aren't so isolated. But so others here won't have, others here will have lost jobs, which also, because they've been shielding or they've had long COVID. You weren't in that position though, Amy, were you? I mean, you were quite secure. In fact, you changed job halfway through.
Yeah, so I changed mine purely because I didn't, and I still don't feel like I would feel safe going back to a frontline job. Just with even though I'm doubly vaccinated, there is a big part of me that so much fear was put into me that I was going to die from this, that the thought of then going back was really difficult, and it's not something that I can get rid of. But again, it was that kind of guilt that I've still been able to have a job, whereas I know other people haven't. It's the guilt of I've got transferable skills that I can put in, but other people can't. So, and I think everyone on this call, the job that we do collectively becomes part of your identity. If someone asks me to describe myself, I describe myself as a nurse. That's who I am. It's ingrained in me. It's the same, sure, with you, Claire, you are a doctor. Yes, it's who you are. And it's how you describe yourself, and it's so much more than a job. So for that to be taken away from you before you're ready, if you're happy and wanting to retire and you're like, I'm done, I'm hanging my stethoscope up, that's one thing. But to have a pandemic come in and completely change every single thing about your life and how you interact with people, the group of friends that you have, I found it extraordinarily difficult to kind of deal with.
I think that's right. And those of you who will be entering the groups starting on the 1st of September, these are the sort of issues that we will discuss. We will discuss to you not just how you've been, what you've lost, but what your sense of identity has done to both facilitate and inhibit your recovery. Because I think sometimes, and I've been looking after doctors for 15 years, I tell you, physician heal thyself is so embedded, and the same for nurses. And it is important because, as we've heard from Amy, you've essentially, Amy, had 3 major life events: a devastating illness, having a hot bath, ending up in ITU. Well, devastating, having a baby, and then having to shield 3, and also a life event of having to change your job. So it's pretty impressive. Before we go into picking up some of the general questions, Emma, you've been nodding away. Do you recognise Amy's story for yourself?
Yes, yeah, so much, Amy. I could just, and this is again the beauty of the group. So Amy and I have had totally different experiences, and we're totally different nurses, but there's so much commonality. On the day that I was diagnosed with long COVID, my best friend since we were 5, her husband died very suddenly, nothing to do with COVID. And the guilt I had about that I couldn't at that point even text her. I was so poorly. And so different to having a baby, which is joyous, it was the other extreme, but that was difficult. And just, yes, I think looking at the chat as well, how it completely changes your life. So I've kind of demoted myself. I went back and I knew I couldn't be the professional lead, because that requires, fast-paced, being very visible, and I felt really sad that I'd almost been forced to give that up. But actually, just picking up some of the bits in the chat, it was probably the best thing that can happen, because naturally I can focus on other things at a calmer pace. And it's interesting, my daughter said to me a little while ago, I've got adult children, but she said, Mum, she said, the day you started to get better was the day you stopped fighting it, and you kind of gave into it and just said, I'm just going to go with this. And listening to what's been said in the chat, I think that's not easy by any means. I'm sitting here now. It wasn't easy. I kept beating myself up. I should be able to get better. I should be able to.
The behaviour therapists on this call will know that the word should be banned, because it's the should, isn't it? I mean, Gavin and Geraldine and Steve, you're the behaviour. I know Vivian's a therapist. Gavin, what do you do with the shoulds?
Yeah, well, good question. Yeah, well, it's usually a red flag of some kind. Yeah. It's just, I guess it's also about not reacting to shoulds with oh no, it's a should, because obviously that's another should. But yeah, about kind of going a bit, inquiring a bit, like what are the assumptions behind that belief? I should never be ill, I should never go to work.
Or somebody, Sonia's put on there, I will never get back to X, Y, and Z. It's this certainty of the negativity, isn't it, that I think the group will help. I mean, clearly, if things become too embedded, then CBT will certainly help. But all these shoulds, which I think health professionals have too many of these automatic negative thoughts about their sense of worth, that's completely intertwined with their caring of others.
Yeah. I think it's also really important in the group to allow yourself to be curious about why you are saying those shoulds, because we all have different sets of shoulds, even though we're all working in the NHS. So our shoulds may be personal to us, as well as in our role and in our identity and our professional life. So it's enabling us to be more curious and ask questions about that, why we think like that. And by freeing yourselves up, or freeing myself up, I can start thinking, well, do I really need to do that? I mean, I know some who joined the long COVID groups that I facilitated, like you, Emma, and Amy, they transformed their lives out of it in a positive way. That may not always happen, but some really did.
And we are, again, for people on this webinar, we're not sprinkling magic fairy dust over you, but actually we also have run 2 long COVID groups for doctors, and the vast majority have improved. And I think there is something magical, having said I'm not going to, about realizing the situations we health professionals get into are automatic assumptions. You've heard Amy and Emma, fabulous nurses who felt really guilty they couldn't care for others. And it wasn't until you accepted that actually you needed to be cared for that things started to get better. Amy, how are things with you now?
Yeah, so getting there. I think anxiety is a big one at the minute, and I'm someone who I'm not anxious. I can say, you know, I've suffered with depression in the past, but anxiety was never something I've suffered with. And I made the mistake of my first proper trip out was going to Tesco. Very bad mistake. Not doing that again for a while. But it was really difficult, and it was, you know, just after I'd had my kind of second dose of vaccine, and left my 3 weeks, and that kind of coincided with you didn't have to mandatory wear your face masks anymore, and I just couldn't deal with it. I went with my partner, and Rupert was at home with someone, so don't panic. I didn't just leave my child on his own, but I very much used him as a bit of a human blocker. Because I was just like, I can't have people close to me. Why are they not scared? Why are they not wearing their masks? How do they think life is normal already? So the anxiety for me is still very much there. I'm really lucky that work are really, really good about it, and they get the anxiety and what have you, and they're just, you know, whenever you're ready to come into the office, it's there. If you want to stay remote, that's also fine. But it's pushing through that anxiety and realizing, you know, there's going to be an element of having to live with this, and knowing that there will be a risk associated. I'm in a much better position than I was 18 months ago, and I have to remember that. But it's still pretty hard, you know, but I'm lucky that we've got support groups like this that, you know, you can share the same feelings with, because they feel the same.
Well, I'd just like to thank both of you for telling us your story, and I'm so pleased both of you are getting better. Amy, can I just ask you, your baby is all right? I mean, he hasn't got the same.
No, he's absolutely fine. So he's too little for it to be a thing if it is a thing. But it's going to be a case of I've got to have a lovely bone marrow biopsy to see if it's a genetic thing. So I've got that to look forward to over the next few months.
I'd just like to say, I mean, you've got and I say this, I'm sure nobody will mind, you are always cheerful. I don't know whether it's Emma, you are as well. I don't know whether it's folk like you that you give me such joy, because you are always cheerful, but I suppose somewhere behind the smiles there's also the anxiety, the fear of what you've both been talking about, and for you, Amy, the unknown, what is going to happen. And I wish you really well. I'm going to hand you over now to Susanna, who's going to pick up some of the Q&As, but also, and please put your Q&As, but also to just have a discussion with the facilitators and bring you two in as well. But the groups start on the 1st of September. We did say they're closed. They are closed, so we do have a sort of a slight variation that we allow them to be slightly open for the first two, so that people who maybe weren't on this webinar that want to join. So, but after that they're closed, and then if other people come, we'll open a new group. But it's just so that we allow a bit of noise at the beginning of any group space of people jostling around, and then you will be with the same therapist, you will be meeting the same people, and if you want to put your cameras on or off you can, but otherwise you can just welcome. So I'm going to say farewell and hand you over to Susanna, and thank you so much all of you for joining. Susanna, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, well, before just any of the questions, I just want to say thank you to Amy and Emma for being so honest. It is not easy to do on a webinar, especially with everything that you've been through. And I just know from the chat, I don't know if you can see it, but there are so many people saying thank you, I agree, I understand, I feel the same way. And as Claire said, our groups are somewhere where you can share these thoughts with each other, you can relate to each other, you can talk about these things over a period of 9 weeks, and this is just a taster of that today. So thank you, Amy and Emma. Have had a couple of questions. So the first one has been about colleagues in the NHS and their reactions. I know we've heard quite a lot before that there's just kind of a bit of a lack of understanding around long COVID and shielding, and people drop in comments like, I hope you've had a nice holiday and things that aren't particularly helpful. Amy and Emma, I don't know if you want to go first. How have you dealt with that, if you've experienced it? Do you have any advice?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I've spent my whole life advocating around stigma for mental illness, because that's my area, and I've never really realised the impact of like an invisible illness. So I like Amy, I generally am a positive person prior to this, and there's two ways that you can approach this, isn't there? I can, and some days I do feel sorry for myself, don't get me wrong, I do. And I allow myself to do that, but most of the time I try and be positive, and then people will say, oh, you look really well, but they haven't probably seen that I had to sleep the day before, and the weekends I tend to sleep. So I just kind of smile and say, oh, thank you. Don't really get into a sort of debate around it, and I will use things like this, or just drop little sort of perhaps social media things about educating people. But yeah, it's hard because just because you look okay and you're cheerful, people have this sort of idea that, oh, you're over it now and that's it. And it's interesting, I went to a wedding at the weekend, which I was very anxious about, like Amy's saying, and didn't know how I'd last the day and whatever, and I really actually enjoyed it. But yesterday it was another story. And lots of people have said to me, oh, you're so good, you're over it, and I'm like, oh, thanks. So I just kind of I just kind of rise above it. In a work environment, I suppose it could be difficult. I'm lucky that the people I work with seem very understanding, so I just I think if it's really bothering you, then speak to someone, but try not to react, I guess. Just not always easy, but that's how I've kind of coped with it. It's difficult.
Emma, what you've said has reminded me very much of when people lose someone close to them, when they die. And, most of our colleagues at work appreciate for the first few weeks that you must be feeling pretty shitty. And then they forget, or they don't want to hear it anymore.
Yes.
And I think it's really important to remind ourselves and others that actually we might look good today, but actually it's not a good experience.
No.
And yes, I still feel unwell at times, so that they can empathise with us eventually. Because I think being healthcare professionals, it's very hard to empathise with healthcare professionals being ill.
It's terrible, isn't it? It's we're the worst at this judging, although we're non-judgmental with our patients and carers, actually with each other. And it's strange because when people started having reactions to their vaccines, and then they'd say, oh my goodness, how have you coped with this for 7 months? I had 24 hours, and I just say, yeah, it's pretty tough, but I think it's just you've got to do what works for you. And stress for me definitely flares up my long COVID symptoms, definitely, and I can't afford to get stressed. Obviously occasionally I might not be able to avoid that, it's the real world, but I just think I can't deal with being stressed about what other people are thinking about me anymore. In the early days I felt terrible, guilt and all of what we've talked about, but now I just think, and you talked about the transformation, my life is very different, but very positively different. So it hasn't all been bad. I've really reevaluated and got a different outlook on life, and I have to be selfish sometimes and think I can't take on your stress just because you're stressed at work, and I feel for you, but I can't feel guilty that I can't help, because the risk to me is and Amy, it's different, but I could end back in bed for a week, and I don't want to do that. So I have to protect myself, and it's getting easier. So that's my sort of advice, but it's hard.
Amy, is there anything you wanted to add?
I completely agree with Emma. I think for me, I was a bit kind of out of sight, out of mind. So I was a bit of the forgotten people, and I very much had the initial, oh, you know, how are you getting on, probably for about a week. But then it was, oh yeah, I forgot you were having a baby, or oh yeah, I forgot you were still part of the team type thing, because you're not there to be seen. And you know, I had some really good friends that did check in consistently and make sure I was okay. But the wider group, I think it's just, I think when I look at it, is that everyone is trying to survive something. They don't know how difficult it's been for you. They, like you say, they probably think I've been sat on the sofa doing nothing and having a great time, which to a point there was some of that. It was quite nice, but at the same time, like I said, had all of those other things. But I think, you know, just because they don't understand your situation doesn't mean that they might not be sympathetic to it. I think they only see this, that they only see through the lens that's being portrayed to them. So if you look like you're happy and you look like you're kind of staying at home, that's the lens that they're going to think that it is constantly. So for me, it's very much, you know, a bit like Emma, be the bigger person, kind of bite your tongue a bit, know that what you've gone through is valid and how you're feeling is valid. The people who truly know you know what you've had to deal with, and they're the people that you want. And for anyone else, it's not, I don't think it's ever there to be malicious. I think they're probably just doing it as a kind of defense mechanism for them and what they've gone through, and using that humor to kind of make it a little bit better for them. Doesn't make it easier on you by any means, because it does make you feel like your experience is not as valid as theirs. But as long as you know in yourself that actually the fact that you've survived what we have survived over the past 18 months, I think in itself, just keep that in your mind when people do say it.
Thank you. So we are coming to the end, sadly, and I know it's been a really powerful time for everyone, just from the comments for me as well, just to hear everyone sharing. There are just a few things before, I just want to hear a few final thoughts from the facilitators before we go, but a couple of questions I just wanted to address. There are no number limits. Don't feel like you're taking anyone's space. Don't feel like there's not a space for you. Equally, if you turn up to one and you just think, actually, this isn't for me, as Emma said, that's absolutely fine. But please do give it a go. You never know what you might experience from it. And just one more question was, I've signed up to the webinar, but I don't know if I'm automatically signed up to the groups. You are. We will send an email round with the Zoom link so that you can get onto the groups. So that will all happen. So just any of the facilitators, I don't know if you have anything finally you'd like to say before we wrap up. Viv.
For me, just to say, it was a real honour and privilege to work with people that are from the NHS who never have had a space really to talk about these experiences, and they're experiences that are very traumatic. And it was an opportunity for us all to think about what that means for everyone in the group. And I look forward to meeting people.
Steve, are you?
Yes, thank you, Emma. Thank you, Amy. It's humbling and very informative. Thank you so much for telling us your stories. It's enormously helped me. So thank you.
Brilliant. So what I'll do is I've popped my email in the chat box. I will pop it in again. So if you have any questions, please do send me an email. I will get back to you as quickly as possible. And I'm just sorry that we haven't been able to get through all the questions today, but if you come to the groups, there'll be space to discuss. So thank you again to everyone. Really appreciate your sharing and your support. And we will see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Take care.